They called me the family disgrace for being a single mother, assuming I would stay quiet. They had no idea I hold two things capable of shattering their precious empire: the mortgage on their home, and one uniquely sweet deal. When their golden son-in-law signed his supposed opportunity of a lifetime, they finally realized the truth. I never pushed them off the cliff. They jumped. I merely stood there, holding the mirror. My name is Skylar Parker. I am 34 years old, an American woman, and above all else, the single mother of a bright little girl named Rosie. I was sitting alone in my dimly lit office when the notification shattered the silence. The digital clock on my desk read precisely 4:15 in the afternoon. The ping originated from the exclusive social network used by the residents of Wexford Ridge. Wexford Ridge is a gated, ultra-wealthy neighborhood where manicured lawns hide decades of generational rot, and perception is the only currency that matters. I picked up my phone. When I unlocked it, I was greeted by a massive block of text authored by my mother, Evelyn Parker. Today was her 60th birthday. Usually, she spent this day receiving lavish gifts and basking in the manufactured adoration of her high society friends. Instead, she chose to use her milestone to execute a public, digital assassination of my character. Her post read like a carefully drafted press release. She announced, with feigned heartbreak and heavy-handed piety, that she and my father were officially severing all ties with me. She wrote that I had hopelessly soiled the pristine Parker family reputation. My crime, according to her tirade, was my refusal to apologize for being a single mother. She painted my independence as a vulgar rebellion that brought shame to their esteemed legacy. Evelyn did not just post this on her private wall. She weaponized the network's tagging feature, meticulously tagging over 300 individuals. The list was a who is who of the local elite. She tagged the senior pastors of the community church, the entire executive board of the regional women's club, the directors of the local charity coalition, and dozens of high-net-worth corporate sponsors who funded her philanthropic endeavors. Within 15 minutes, the post had amassed nearly 500 likes and over 120 comments. It was a digital public execution, calculated to ensure I would be permanently exiled from every respectable circle in our county. I scrolled down, my face entirely impassive, watching the reactions roll in real time. My younger sister, Brooke Parker, was the first to amplify the cruelty. She left a heart emoji and a cheering reaction, commenting about the heavy burden of upholding family morals when someone insists on dragging the name through the mud. But the comment that truly solidified my resolve came from Brooke's husband, Caleb Voss. Caleb is a certified public accountant and a high-level financial advisor. He spends his days managing wealth and curating an image of the perfect, moral, traditional family man. His comment was a sickening masterpiece of hypocrisy. He wrote that it was deeply tragic to witness a destroyer of family harmony inflict such emotional distress on a devoted mother on her special day. He publicly called for the community to send prayers to Evelyn and Brooke as they navigated this painful betrayal. He positioned himself as the noble protector, throwing me under the bus to polish his own golden boy halo. My heart maintained a slow, steady rhythm. Years ago, a public humiliation of this magnitude would have devastated me. I would have drafted a dozen frantic, emotional responses, begging my mother to take the post down, pleading with the community to understand my side. I would have played right into their hands, cementing my role as the unstable, ruined daughter. But I am no longer that frightened girl. I did not hit reply. I did not engage in a futile online war. I simply turned off the screen, plunging the device into blackness, and set it face down on my polished wooden desk. I calmly pushed my chair back and opened the heavy bottom drawer of my secure filing cabinet. I reached inside and withdrew a thick, cream-colored folder. I ran my fingers over the smooth cardstock. I had been compiling the contents of this folder for a very long time, waiting for the precise moment when their arrogance would eclipse their caution. Before I could step onto the battlefield, I had to ensure my greatest treasure was heavily guarded. I packed my leather briefcase, left the office, and drove across town to pick up Rosie. She bounded into the back seat, her laughter filling the small space, completely unaware of the vicious digital bomb her grandmother had just detonated. Looking at her innocent smile in the rearview mirror, my chest tightened with an immovable protective instinct. They looked at her and saw a scandalous mistake. I looked at her and saw my reason for breathing. I drove directly to the home of Naomi Trent. Naomi is my most loyal, trusted friend, the only person in this town who knows the true extent of the Parker family's psychological cruelty. She was waiting on her front porch. When I stepped out of the car, she took one look at my hardened expression and understood immediately this was not a routine babysitting request. I knelt down, wrapped my arms tightly around Rosie, and told her to have the absolute best time playing games with Naomi. I waited until they were safely inside, the heavy wooden door clicking shut and locking. Rosie was entirely secure. She would not witness a single second of the ugliness about to unfold. I returned to my car, gripping the steering wheel. The digital clock on my dashboard read exactly 6:45 in the evening. Evelyn's lavish birthday gala was scheduled to begin at 7 o'clock sharp. I shifted into drive and merged onto the main highway, pointing my vehicle toward the Ivory Glen Conservatory Hall. It is the most opulent, exclusive venue in the entire district, a sprawling architectural marvel of steel and glass where the local aristocracy gathered to flaunt their wealth and exchange venomous whispers. The drive took exactly 25 minutes. The city lights blurred past my windows, but my mind remained razor-sharp, analyzing the situation with the cold precision of a surgeon. I mentally reviewed the sequence of events I was about to trigger. I glanced at the passenger seat. Resting there was a sleek, heavy document box, sealed tight, containing the cream-colored folder. I told myself over and over that tonight was not a night for crying. This was not a night to demand a forced apology or to defend my choices to a room full of people who were determined to misunderstand me. Explanations are a luxury reserved for those who wish to be welcomed back into the fold. I had absolutely no desire to return to the suffocating prison of the Parker family empire. I wanted to dismantle it. Tonight was simply the night to position the first domino and give it a gentle, deliberate push. I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of the Ivory Glen Conservatory Hall. A small army of valets in crisp uniforms were rushing frantically back and forth, opening the doors of expensive European sports cars and luxury sedans. I ignored the valet stand entirely. I drove to the far edge of the sprawling parking lot and parked my modest vehicle in the shadows. I turned off the ignition and sat in the quiet darkness for exactly 3 minutes. I smoothed the lapels of my dark charcoal suit, ensuring every line was severe and perfect. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. My eyes were completely hollow of emotion. My expression revealed absolutely nothing. I reached across the console and picked up the sealed document box. The weight of it felt incredibly satisfying in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of months of silent, meticulous observation and unyielding patience. I stepped out of the car into the crisp night air. The gravel crunched rhythmically beneath my heels as I marched toward the grand entrance. Straight ahead, the towering glass doors of the conservatory hall glowed with brilliant, warm amber light. I could clearly see the silhouettes of hundreds of elegantly dressed guests moving inside. They were the very same people Evelyn had tagged in her vicious online post, currently sipping expensive champagne and waiting to celebrate a woman who believed she had just crushed her own daughter under her heel. I adjusted my grip on my special birthday gift. I kept my shoulders back, my spine rigid, and walked straight into the light. The chill of the evening air against my face was a sharp contrast to the burning memories that usually accompanied thoughts of my family. 7 years ago, my pregnancy was treated not as a life-altering blessing, but as a terminal diagnosis for the Parker family image. The day I refused their mandate to quietly give the baby up for adoption was the day I ceased to exist in their world. The erasure was swift, clinical, and devastatingly thorough. My name vanished from the embossed holiday cards. My security clearance at the gated entrance of our neighborhood was revoked. My trust fund, previously set to vest on my 25th birthday, was legally dissolved under a morality clause my father had his lawyers unearth from a decades-old family charter. They never laid a hand on me, and to their credit, they never physically threatened Rosie. Violence was entirely too pedestrian for people like Evelyn and Martin Parker. Their weapon of choice was social starvation. They believed that by cutting off my financial oxygen and turning my childhood friends into strangers who crossed the street to avoid me, the sheer weight of poverty and public shame would break my spirit. They assumed I would eventually crawl back to their manicured doorstep, weeping, contrite, and willing to hide my daughter away like a shameful secret in exchange for a monthly allowance. They fundamentally misunderstood the daughter they raised. The isolation did not break me. It forged me. Stripped of my inheritance and my safety net, I had to learn how to survive in the brutal machinery of the real world. I discovered that I had a unique talent for looking at broken, ruined things and seeing exactly how to extract value from them. While they spent the last 7 years assuming I was scraping by on food stamps and government assistance, I was quietly building Northline Recovery Group from the ground up. I started in a cramped, windowless room, buying up microscopic portfolios of delinquent credit card debt. By the time Rosie was walking, I had moved on to commercial liquidations. Today, Northline is a premier firm specializing in corporate crisis management, asset restructuring, and distressed debt acquisition. When a mid-sized manufacturing company goes into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, my firm is the one that swoops in, buys their outstanding liabilities for pennies on the dollar, and either carves out the profitable divisions or forces a highly lucrative settlement. I spend my days dismantling failing empires, to the Parker family. However, I am nothing more than a cautionary tale. Whenever a nosy country club associate asks about Evelyn's oldest daughter, she sighs tragically and whispers that I do low-level freelance consulting, struggling to make ends meet in some undesirable zip code. They need me to be a failure. Their entire moral superiority complex hinges on the narrative that deviating from their rigid, conservative blueprint leads to total ruin. Because of this, I never bothered to correct them. I maintained a strict policy of silent observation. I did not engage in screaming matches. I did not send angry emails. I simply watched from the shadows. And what I saw was a family desperately trying to outrun their own reality. Over the past 4 years, I noticed a dramatic shift in their lifestyle. Brooke and Caleb traded their practical sedans for matching, custom-ordered European sports cars that retailed for well over $150,000 each. Evelyn embarked on a massive magazine-worthy renovation of the estate's west wing. They were taking lavish vacations to private islands in the Mediterranean and hosting extravagant dinner parties that cost tens of thousands of dollars to cater. It was a stunning display of wealth, but mathematically, it made absolutely no sense. I knew what my father's regional supply company brought in annually, and I knew the standard salary cap for a certified public accountant of Caleb's tenure. The math was violently misaligned. They were bleeding cash, projecting an image of boundless prosperity that their actual income streams could not possibly support. My professional curiosity took over. I treat every problem like a distressed asset, and the Parker family was glowing red on my radar. I began running quiet, perfectly legal background checks. I pulled the publicly available tax documents and financial disclosures for the Parker Legacy Women's Fund, the crown jewel of my mother's philanthropic empire. Evelyn had spent the last decade using the charity to cement her status as the benevolent queen of Wexford Ridge. It took weeks of meticulously cross-referencing public ledgers late into the night, long after Rosie was asleep, but the discrepancies eventually revealed themselves. The fingerprints were incredibly sloppy. Caleb's name, and the names of several obscure limited liability companies registered to his old fraternity brothers, appeared with alarming frequency in the vendor disbursement logs. There were repeated, exorbitant payouts for event organization, strategic consulting fees, and marketing logistics. The charity was paying top-tier Manhattan prices for services supposedly rendered by shell companies in our suburban county. I found invoices for a spring gala where the catering budget was inflated by nearly 300% compared to industry standards. It was a classic, albeit arrogant, skimming operation. Evelyn was using the charity's massive endowment as a personal slush fund, and Caleb was the architect laundering the money through fabricated vendor contracts to fund their sudden explosion of luxury. Finding the anomalies was only the first step. Anomalies are easily dismissed as clerical errors or aggressive accounting by people with expensive lawyers. I needed undeniable, concrete proof. I needed the smoking gun. For 8 agonizing months, I gathered every scrap of data. I hired private investigators to photograph the empty storefronts listed as the headquarters for Caleb's vendor companies. I legally acquired digital copies of the actual catering receipts from the true vendors, comparing them side by side with the fraudulent invoices submitted to the charity's board. I built an ironclad, indisputable portfolio of systematic financial fraud. I waited patiently, suppressing every urge to strike early, until I had enough leverage to ensure that when I finally dropped the hammer, there would be no room for spin, no chance for damage control, and no possibility of survival for their social standing. I wanted the revelation to happen precisely when Evelyn felt the most powerful, surrounded by the very people she had lied to and stolen from. And now, that moment has arrived. As I walk toward the glowing entrance of the Ivory Glen Conservatory Hall, the cream-colored folder rests securely inside the heavy box in my hands. The guests inside are expecting a night of speeches, charity auctions, and endless self-congratulation. They are unaware that the box I carry contains more than just the agonizingly detailed proof of my family's crimes. Tucked beneath the financial ledgers and the damning photographs is a single, heavily stamped legal notice from a state regulatory agency. It is a document so severe and so legally binding that the moment it is opened, it will not just humiliate my mother, it will instantly freeze the charity's bank accounts, legally paralyzing the entire event right there in the middle of the grand ballroom. The heavy glass doors yielded to my push, sealing the crisp night behind me and plunging me into a symphony of clinking crystal and muted, expensive laughter. I stood at the threshold of the grand ballroom, the thick carpet absorbing my footsteps. At the far end of the room, elevated on a velvet-draped stage, my mother stood behind a lucite podium. She wore a shimmering emerald gown, diamonds glittering at her throat, bathed in the warm spotlight. She was mid-sentence, her voice projected through the state-of-the-art sound system, weaving a sickeningly sweet tapestry about the cornerstone of society. She spoke of unwavering morals, of the sacrifices required to maintain a model household, and how the fabric of our great community relied on families who upheld traditional virtues. The audience, composed of the wealthiest patrons and most influential board members in the county, hung on her every word. I began to walk down the central aisle. I did not rush. My pace was measured, my gaze fixed squarely on the woman at the podium. It took exactly 30 seconds for the whispers to begin. Heads turned, glasses were lowered. The subtle rustle of silk and taffeta rippled through the crowd as people recognized the pariah walking among them. Finally, Evelyn's eyes locked onto mine. She faltered, the perfectly rehearsed cadence of her speech shattered. For a fleeting second, panic flashed across her meticulously powdered face, quickly replaced by a mask of cold fury. She leaned into the microphone, her voice dropping an octave, abandoning her philanthropic script to address the intrusion. She demanded to know what I was doing there, stating publicly that my presence was an insult to the respectable people gathered in the room. She commanded me to leave immediately, projecting to the hundreds of guests that a woman who chose to disgrace her lineage by bearing a child out of wedlock had absolutely no place at a gathering dedicated to family values. The ballroom plunged into absolute silence. The tension was a physical weight pressing against the vaulted ceiling. They were all waiting for the dramatic breakdown. They expected me to scream, to cry, to hurl insults, to provide them with the scandalous entertainment they so desperately craved. I did none of those things. I did not utter a single word in my defense. I reached the large circular table positioned directly in front of the stage, reserved for the platinum tier sponsors. I placed the sleek document box squarely in the center of the pristine white tablecloth. The dull thud echoed in the cavernous, quiet room. I looked up at Evelyn and spoke in a clear, conversational tone that carried perfectly through the silent hall. I told her I had brought her a birthday gift, and I insisted she open it right then, in front of the community she loved so much. Evelyn scoffed, attempting to maintain her regal composure, but curiosity and a flicker of genuine apprehension betrayed her. She stepped down from the stage, her emerald gown trailing behind her, flanked by my sister Brooke, who looked equally confused and enraged. Evelyn reached the table, her manicured fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before breaking the seal on the box. She pulled out the cream-colored folder, opening it with an arrogant flick of her wrist. I watched her eyes dart across the top page. I watched the blood rapidly drain from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. The document on top was not a greeting card. It was a formal, legally binding notice of immediate suspension regarding the matching donation pledge for the evening. The second document was a severe warning from the State Charity Commission, citing gross irregularities in the fund's financial disclosures and mandating an immediate freeze on all external disbursements. Evelyn stammered, looking wildly around the room, demanding to know what this fabricated nonsense was. She tried to shove the papers back into the box, but I placed my hand firmly over hers, forcing her to hold them. I informed her, my voice completely devoid of malice or triumph, that the papers were entirely real. I then delivered the information that I knew would completely break her reality. For the past 2 consecutive years, the massive anonymous corporate grants that had kept her foundation afloat, the exact funds she used to inflate her social standing and mask the internal bleeding, originated from a private equity vehicle. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I was the sole managing director of that vehicle. The gasp from Brooke was audible. Evelyn looked as though the floor had vanished beneath her expensive heels. The outcast daughter, the supposedly destitute single mother, had been secretly bankrolling her entire facade. Before Evelyn could formulate a single coherent sentence of denial, the heavy mahogany doors at the side of the hall burst open. The general manager of the Ivory Glen Conservatory Hall rushed in, his face slick with sweat, a glaring tablet gripped in his hand. He bypassed the security detail and practically sprinted to the auctioneer, who was standing by the display of luxury vacation packages. The manager grabbed the microphone. He looked out at the bewildered crowd and announced, his voice shaking, that all bidding and financial transactions for the evening had to be halted immediately. He explained that he had just received an urgent call from their merchant services provider. The charity's primary receiving accounts had just been flagged by a federal compliance algorithm and placed under a hard audit freeze. They could not process a single dollar. The silence shattered. The room erupted into a cacophony of panicked whispers, outraged murmurs, and frantic questions. The elite sponsors, the people who wrote checks with 5 zeros, began aggressively questioning the board members seated at their tables. Evelyn stood frozen, the papers trembling in her hands, completely paralyzed on the very stage she had built to showcase her supreme moral authority. Her carefully constructed kingdom was burning down around her in real time. Sensing the catastrophic collapse of their social capital, Caleb stepped forward from the shadows of the stage wing. He puffed out his chest, his face flushed with manufactured righteous indignation. He pointed a finger at me, loudly declaring to the surrounding tables that I was a vindictive liar, a disgruntled outcast attempting to ruin a beautiful evening with forged documents and illegal cyber tricks. He tried to rally the crowd, insisting that his accounting firm would have caught any genuine irregularities and that this was nothing more than a pathetic, hysterical stunt. I turned my body slowly to face him. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply let my eyes lock onto his, stripping away his polished exterior until he was nothing more than the terrified, greedy man he truly was. I said to him, clearly and deliberately, that I fully expected him to maintain that exact, confident statement when the forensic auditors arrived at his office tomorrow morning. Caleb's jaw snapped shut. The aggressive posture dissolved instantly, replaced by a rigid, wide-eyed terror. He swallowed hard, completely unable to utter another word of defense. The surrounding guests, Astute individuals who understood the lethal weight of the term forensic auditor immediately shifted their gaze from me to Caleb. They saw his panic. They saw the guilt radiating from his silence. The judgment of the crowd pivoted in a split second. My work for the evening was complete. The first domino had fallen, and the chain reaction was now completely unstoppable. I turned away from the table, away from the pale, trembling figures of my family, and began the walk back down the central aisle. I did not look back. I listened to the chaotic symphony of a destroyed reputation playing out behind me. Evelyn was desperately trying to speak into a dead microphone. Sponsors were demanding their checkbooks back. Board members were shouting at Caleb. For the first time in her meticulously curated life, my mother had entirely lost control of her audience. I pushed the heavy glass doors open, stepping back out into the cool, quiet night, leaving the burning wreckage of the Parker legacy far behind me. The morning sun was barely bleeding through the dense smog of the industrial district when the heavy metal door of Unit 7 swung violently open. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. I was sitting behind a chipped, faux wood laminate desk in a cramped room that smelled faintly of oxidized metal, motor oil, and stale coffee. This was not the actual multi-million-dollar headquarters of Northline Recovery Group. This was a carefully constructed decoy office. It was a registered mail drop I maintained in a dilapidated commercial park, specifically to intercept nuisance lawsuits, aggressive process servers, and bottom-feeding creditors who tried to track me down. It was precisely 40 square feet of intentional misery, illuminated by a single, buzzing fluorescent tube that cast a sickly yellow pallor over the entire space. Caleb and Brooke marched into the room without knocking, bringing with them the overpowering scent of expensive designer cologne and desperately misplaced confidence. Their eyes immediately swept the miserable, dusty surroundings, and I watched the rigid tension leave their shoulders. The smugness returned to their faces in an absolute instant. They took one look at the peeling linoleum floor, the solitary rusting filing cabinet, and the water stains blooming across the ceiling tiles, and they immediately convinced themselves of a comforting lie. They believed that the grand, terrifying display at the conservatory hall the night before had been nothing more than an elaborate, desperate bluff. They believed I had emptied my meager savings account just to rent a tailored suit and play the part of a wealthy, influential executive for a single. Spiteful evening. Brooke let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed harshly against the bare walls. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her limited-edition leather handbag dangling aggressively from her wrist. She sneered at the pathetic environment, turning her nose up as if the very air in the room was contaminating her. She told me it was incredibly pathetic to witness how far I had fallen. She stated that if I truly wanted to live peacefully in the same county as respectable people, I needed to learn my actual place at the bottom of the ladder instead of trying to play dress-up and ruin her husband's good name. Caleb did not bother with pleasantries or greetings. He stepped right up to the edge of the flimsy desk, his jaw set in a hard, aggressive line, and slapped a thick manila envelope onto the scratched surface. He leaned forward, placing both of his manicured hands flat on the desk, attempting to loom over me and use his physical presence as an intimidation tactic. He told me the little stunt last night was a cute attempt at revenge, but playtime was officially over and the adults were back in charge. He reached into the envelope, pulled out a dense legal document printed on heavy stock paper, and slid it directly toward me. It was a tripartite settlement agreement, drafted overnight by his desperate attorneys. The terms were laughably aggressive and completely delusional. First, I was to immediately contact the State Charity Commission and completely withdraw my formal audit request, citing a severe misunderstanding of the complex financial records. Second, I was to irrevocably transfer my remaining 5% voting interest in the old Parker Family Land Trust directly into his name by the end of the business day. Finally, I was to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, binding me to absolute, permanent silence regarding the foundation, his accounting firm, and my mother's personal finances. I looked down at the paper, keeping my face completely blank and devoid of any emotional reaction. I did not reach for the pen he had placed beside it. I asked him, keeping my voice soft and deliberately hesitant. What would happen if I simply refused to sign his paperwork? Caleb smiled, but the expression was entirely devoid of warmth or humanity. It was the predatory, arrogant grin of a man who firmly believed he held every single advantage in the room. He leaned even closer, lowering his voice into a calculated, venomous threat. He informed me that he knew exactly how fragile my little independent consulting business must be. He said he had deep, influential connections with every major lending institution, corporate restructuring firm, and private equity board within a 500-mile radius. If I did not sign the agreement by noon today, he promised to make a few strategic phone calls to his network. He threatened to leak fabricated insider information suggesting that I routinely falsified my own ledgers, mismanaged client funds, and operated a fraudulent enterprise. He assured me he could orchestrate a professional whisper campaign so vicious and pervasive that it would cost me every single contract I had managed to scrape together over the last 7 years. He explicitly stated he was not going to drag my daughter into it, but he would absolutely obliterate my career until I was completely destitute and begging for scraps. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I forced my shoulders to slump slightly inward, projecting the exact image he wanted to see: a defeated, terrified woman desperately trying to find a way out of a corner. I kept my voice quiet, almost a submissive whisper, as I asked him why he needed the Legacy Land Trust shares so urgently. I asked him to explain to me why the state audit was such a catastrophic problem if his ledgers were actually perfectly clean, exactly like he loudly claimed in front of the entire gala last night. It is a fundamental, fatal flaw in deeply arrogant men. They simply cannot resist the overwhelming urge to explain their brilliance to someone they consider vastly inferior. Caleb took the bait flawlessly. He straightened up, adjusting his expensive silk tie, visibly emboldened by my apparent surrender and confusion. He sighed heavily, speaking to me as if I were a particularly slow, uneducated child. He explained that high-level wealth management required creative, fluid capital allocation that simple minds could not grasp. He admitted, with a chilling, casual flippancy, that the charity's funds were never truly missing or stolen. He called his actions a temporary strategic liquidity bridge. He boasted that he had simply redirected the foundation's inactive capital to float a private, high-yield commercial development project that was experiencing a minor cash flow bottleneck. Furthermore, he admitted to using a portion of the funds to cover margin calls on a few personal investment accounts that had temporarily dipped underwater due to unpredictable market volatility. He insisted, with absolute conviction, that he was going to put every single dollar back into the charity accounts before the fiscal year ended, plus a modest return. He claimed the state audit was merely an annoying, bureaucratic hurdle that would unfairly freeze his assets, trigger unnecessary alarms, and ruin his masterful financial timeline. He stood in the middle of my decoy office and verbally confirmed every single theory I had spent 8 agonizing months documenting. He freely admitted to commingling funds, executing unauthorized wire transfers, breaching his fiduciary duty, and utilizing charitable donations to cover his private investment losses. He gave me the motive, the exact method, and his own twisted justification, all wrapped up in a spectacular bow of breathtaking hubris. Brooke nodded along the entire time, looking at her husband with misplaced, naive admiration. She chimed in, adding that the family had to do whatever was necessary to maintain their proper standard of living, and I was simply too ignorant and jealous to understand the complexities of high finance. I let the heavy silence hang in the cramped room for exactly 10 seconds. I let Caleb savor his perceived victory, watching him breathe in the stale air as if it were the finest champagne. I looked down at the contract he had placed before me one last time, and then I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal blazer. I did not pull out a pen to sign his demands. I pulled out a small, rectangular digital voice recorder. The tiny bright red light on the top of the device was glowing steadily. I placed it gently on the center of the scratched laminate desk, setting it right on top of his ridiculous, extortionate settlement agreement. Caleb's arrogant, triumphant smile vanished instantly. His eyes locked onto the glowing red light, his face contorting in sudden, violent realization. The air seemed to leave his lungs all at once. He practically choked on his next breath. He stammered, his voice rising in high-pitched panic, shouting that I could not do that, claiming it was a severe violation of privacy and completely illegal to record a private conversation without his explicit written consent. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back in my cheap, uncomfortable chair, the metallic screech of the springs cutting sharply through the heavy air in the room. I calmly raised my hand and pointed past his shoulder. I instructed him to turn around and look closely at the heavy metal door they had barged through less than 15 minutes ago. Caleb spun around abruptly. Affixed securely to the center of the door, right at exact eye level, was a bright yellow, legally compliant warning placard. It stated in bold, unmistakable black lettering that the premises were under continuous audio and visual surveillance for security purposes, and that entry into the office constituted explicit, irrevocable consent to be recorded by the management. He had been so blinded by his own superiority that he had walked right past it without a second glance. I watched his posture completely disintegrate. The healthy color drained rapidly from his face, leaving him a sickening, ashen shade of gray. He realized in that agonizing, silent moment that he had just handed the executioner the sharpened axe. He had walked into a room believing he was the apex predator, only to discover he had willingly, foolishly, stepped into a flawless steel trap. He had just confessed to multiple state and federal financial felonies on a pristine, legally admissible audio recording. Brooke looked frantically back and forth between the recorder on the desk and her husband's terrified face, the brutal reality of the situation slowly dawning on her horrified features. I looked at Caleb, my expression completely hollow of any mercy or familial warmth. I told him he should have paid much closer attention to his surroundings before making threats he could not back up. I left the recorder sitting on the desk, letting the steady red light burn into his vision. I knew right then that I possessed the ultimate confession. The warm-up exercises were officially over. The real, unmitigated war had just begun. I did not immediately dial emergency services after Caleb and Brooke fled my decoy office. Involving local law enforcement is a remarkably inefficient way to dismantle a white-collar criminal. Police investigations take months, sometimes years, to untangle complex financial fraud, and they leave too much room for high-priced defense attorneys to muddy the waters. I had no intention of allowing Caleb the luxury of a slow, prolonged defense. Instead, I aimed my sights precisely at the single pillar holding up his entire existence. I targeted his professional accounting license and his unblemished reputation within the financial sector. I left the industrial park and drove straight to the sleek, glass-enclosed conference room of my actual legal counsel. We did not waste a single minute celebrating. We immediately transitioned into the execution phase of our strategy. Over the next 4 hours, my team of corporate attorneys and forensic specialists assembled a series of heavily encrypted digital dossiers and physically bound legal packets. We executed a synchronized, multi-pronged strike. Precisely at 9 o'clock the following morning, the first set of files was hand-delivered to the State Board of Accountancy, the governing body holding the absolute power to permanently strip Caleb of his credentials. A duplicate package was dispatched to the Enforcement Division of the State Charity Regulatory Agency. Most importantly, we transmitted tailored briefs directly to the risk management departments of the 7 largest corporate donors who had inadvertently funded my mother's vanity projects. The dossiers were incredibly comprehensive. They contained the pristine, legally obtained audio recording of Caleb completely detailing his embezzlement strategy from the morning prior. We included high-resolution transaction excerpts and color-coded flowcharts mapping the exact movement of capital from the charity's primary receiving accounts directly into the shadow entities Caleb controlled. We also provided a meticulously verified timeline contrasting the dates of these illicit transfers against the lies Evelyn had projected from the stage during her birthday gala. However, the true lethal force of our legal strike relied on an asset Caleb never saw coming. 3 weeks prior to the disastrous gala, A junior accountant working directly beneath Caleb at Hailward Ledger Partners had quietly reached out to my investigative team. He was a bright, deeply nervous young man who had noticed the glaring irregularities in the Capital Bridge accounts. Realizing he was being unknowingly positioned as a scapegoat to take the fall for the missing funds, he chose self-preservation over corporate loyalty. He signed a comprehensive whistleblower cooperation agreement with my firm. In exchange for full legal immunity and guaranteed placement at a rival firm, he provided us with unedited, raw copies of the internal ledgers Caleb thought he had successfully scrubbed. It was the definitive proof that tied the audio confession to the digital money trail. The impact of our coordinated delivery was immediate and devastating. I received real-time updates from my lead attorney as the trap snapped shut. At exactly 11:15 in the morning, Caleb was sitting in a high-level quarterly review meeting with the senior partners of Hailward Ledger Partners, confidently projecting revenue forecasts for the upcoming fiscal year. According to the internal sources my team monitored, the firm's chief compliance officer abruptly interrupted the meeting. He walked into the glass-walled room with a printed copy of the notice we had served to the state board. Right there, in front of his peers, his superiors, and his junior staff. Caleb was formally stripped of all authority. He was handed a notice of temporary suspension of financial signatory rights. His corporate access badges were deactivated on the spot. His ability to authorize trades, sign off on tax filings, or move a single cent of client money was instantly revoked pending a full federal and state investigation. He was instructed to pack his personal belongings into a standard cardboard box and was escorted out of the building by private security. It was a sterile, bureaucratic decapitation. Back in the manicured bubble of Wexford Ridge, the panic was beginning to set in. Though entirely misplaced, Brooke was in a state of frantic denial. Through the network of neighborhood informants I still loosely monitored, I learned she was desperately trying to convince her social circle that Caleb was merely the victim of a corporate misunderstanding and a vicious smear campaign orchestrated by a jealous sibling. She firmly believed they could simply spin the narrative. She relied heavily on the historical fact that our mother possessed an uncanny, almost terrifying ability to manipulate local public opinion and rewrite reality to suit her needs. I had fully anticipated this exact defense mechanism. People accustomed to controlling the narrative will always default to a public relations war when their facts are utterly indefensible. Because of this predictable arrogance, I had strictly instructed my legal team not to release the entirety of our evidence in the initial salvo. I deliberately held back several crucial pieces of documentation. I kept my most damaging cards hidden, waiting for Evelyn to make her inevitable, foolish move in the public square. My phone vibrated against the polished mahogany of the conference table. The caller identification displayed Evelyn's private mobile number. I let it ring 4 times before calmly pressing the accept button. Her voice came through the speaker, dripping with a sickeningly sweet, entirely fabricated maternal warmth. She bypassed the catastrophic events of the gala and the humiliating morning Caleb had just experienced, asking if we could simply sit down over a cup of coffee and have a private, healing conversation. It was a thinly veiled reconnaissance mission. She was completely desperate to gauge the extent of my knowledge and figure out exactly how much ammunition I still possessed. I kept my voice flat, completely devoid of any emotional inflection, matching the cold precision of the legal documents piled in front of me. I told her that our relationship was no longer a matter of family dynamics, but a strictly documented legal dispute. I advised her to direct any further communication exclusively through my retained counsel. I did not wait for her to formulate a manipulative response. I simply disconnected the call, leaving her to face the deafening silence of her own collapsing empire. As I set the phone face down, the screen briefly illuminated with a new incoming text message from my lead attorney, who was working in the adjacent office. The message was brief, highly strategic, and profoundly heavy. I read the words displayed on the glowing screen. If they choose to launch a public smear campaign again, we are fully prepared to unseal the Memorial Fund file. I locked the screen. The Memorial Fund was an old, buried secret so dark and so fundamentally destructive that it dwarfed the current embezzlement scandal entirely. If Evelyn forced my hand in the court of public opinion, I was more than ready to unleash a ghost from the past that would ensure the Parker name was permanently erased from polite society. The digital ecosystem of Wexford Ridge operates on a very predictable frequency. When a scandal breaks, the community does not seek the truth. They seek the most entertaining narrative. By 9 o'clock the next morning, my mother decided to launch her counteroffensive. Cornered animals in the suburbs do not bare their teeth directly. They wrap themselves in the flag of victimhood and weaponize their prayer groups. My tablet chimed with a priority notification from the Homeowner Association's private portal, simultaneously mirrored on the Grace Fellowship Church Community Board. Evelyn had published a sprawling 4,000-word manifesto. It was a masterclass in manipulative fiction, designed to completely rewrite the catastrophic events of the previous night. She abandoned the narrative of the rebellious daughter and introduced a far more sinister plotline. She publicly accused me of financial elder abuse. According to her melodramatic post, my estrangement from the family was not due to their cruelty regarding my pregnancy. Instead, she claimed I had been caught embezzling from my late grandmother's memorial fund. This fund was supposedly a sacred trust earmarked for pediatric healthcare initiatives. Evelyn wrote that I had drained the accounts to fund a reckless, unsustainable lifestyle as a single mother, and that her decision to disown me was a painful but necessary act of moral preservation. She painted herself as the weeping matriarch, shielding the family from my toxic, jealous rage directed entirely at my sister Brooke. The echo chamber activated instantly. Within 10 minutes, the post garnered over 200 sympathetic reactions. Brooke was the first to cement the narrative in the comment section. She typed out a paragraph's-long response, dripping with condescending pity. She claimed her heart was shattered seeing her older sister consumed by such bitter envy, urging the community to pray for my supposedly fragile mental health. Brooke's wealthy, bored friends immediately piled on, using highly sanitized, weaponized therapy speak. They called me a toxic narcissist, a bitter single mother lashing out at a perfectly intact, loving household. They formed a digital lynch mob, completely intoxicated by their own perceived moral superiority. I sat at my desk, watching the comments multiply in real time. My pulse did not elevate a single beat. I did not draft a frantic, emotional rebuttal. I did not engage in a pathetic digital shouting match. I simply opened the encrypted drive on my desktop, located a master file I had secured 3 years ago, and prepared a single, devastating reply. I uploaded a consolidated document file. It contained no defensive prose, no pleas for understanding, and no emotional manipulation. It was a 70-page forensic dossier. Every single page featured a permanent digital watermark, a verified electronic timestamp, and a flawless chain of custody tracking. I hit reply and let the documents speak for themselves. The first 20 pages were direct transcripts of the Memorial Fund's internal bank ledgers. I highlighted a specific series of withdrawals made over a 6-month period 5 years ago. Next to these bank records, I attached side-by-side comparisons of vendor invoices. The narrative the documents told was irrefutable. The money intended for pediatric charities had been systematically diverted into a shell account labeled as miscellaneous event costs. Then came the undeniable twist. I attached a beautifully itemized invoice for exactly $48,000, paid in full from that exact shell account. The vendor was a high-end, luxury event planner based in the city. The invoice was for a deeply extravagant, sugar-themed launch party. It included line items for imported spun sugar sculptures, custom pink champagne fountains, and a branded cotton candy booth. It was the exact launch party Brooke had hosted when she briefly attempted to start a boutique luxury confectionery brand, a vanity project that folded after 8 months. Brooke had literally built her sugary, pastel-colored brand debut using money stolen from our dead grandmother's charitable trust. It was the sweetest, most sickening irony, and I laid it bare for the entire neighborhood to see. But I did not stop at Brooke's vanity project. The killing blow was buried on page 55. I uploaded a certified third-party forensic handwriting analysis. It displayed the supposedly authentic signature of my grandmother on the initial transfer authorization forms, dated 2 weeks after she had been legally declared medically incapacitated by her neurologist. Directly beneath it, the software mapped the precise loops, pressure points, and angles of the signature. It was a perfect, unquestionable match to Evelyn Parker's distinct, sweeping cursive. I provided absolute proof that my mother had committed felony forgery to raid a dying woman's accounts, the community forum, previously buzzing with hundreds of self-righteous comments, went dead silent. For exactly 22 minutes, not a single person typed a word. The digital courtroom had just been presented with cold, hard evidence, and the jury was completely paralyzed. The silence was finally broken by Richard Thorne. Richard was a retired corporate compliance officer and a highly respected elder in the church community. He did not use emojis or exclamation points. He posted a single, sterile paragraph analyzing the dossier I had provided. He stated, with absolute professional certainty, that the documents represented textbook wire fraud, embezzlement, and a severe breach of fiduciary duty. He noted that the digital signatures and watermarks made the evidence legally bulletproof. He concluded by stating that this was no longer a tragic family dispute, but a matter for the federal authorities. The shift in the digital atmosphere was violent and instantaneous. The sycophantic friends who had been defending Brooke minutes earlier began frantically deleting their comments, desperate to distance themselves from a documented felony. The real-world consequences manifested with terrifying speed. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the executive board of the local philanthropic coalition convened an emergency telephone conference. Evelyn was immediately and indefinitely suspended from her position as community treasurer. Her access to all organizational funds permanently revoked. 30 minutes later, Brooke received a formal automated email from the country club board, stripping her of her coveted position on the summer gala planning committee, citing a violation of their morality clause. Caleb, who had been trying to salvage his own career that morning, found his name explicitly tagged in the internal risk assessment emails of 4 major regional banks, effectively blacklisting him from any future corporate sponsorships in the district. At exactly 3:45 in the afternoon, Evelyn Panic deleted her entire original post. She erased her sprawling, manipulative essay, hoping to scrub the evidence of her humiliation from the internet. But she was far too late. The files had already been downloaded hundreds of times. The screenshots were circulating wildly through private group chats, text message threads, and email chains across the entire upper echelon of Wexford Ridge. Evelyn had spent 4 decades meticulously constructing an empire built on the illusion of absolute perfection and moral superiority. In less than 8 hours, using nothing but her own paper trail, I had reduced her pristine reputation to absolute, unrecoverable ash. The vibration of my phone broke the sterile silence of my office. It was exactly 4:30 in the afternoon. The caller identification displayed a name that had not graced my screen in over 4 years. It was Martin Parker, my father. I answered the call and did not offer a greeting. I merely listened to the heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was entirely unrecognizable. The booming, authoritative patriarch of the Parker family had been replaced by a hollow, trembling old man. He did not yell. He did not demand anything. He simply begged. He pleaded with me to stop the bleeding. He asked me to pull back the lawyers, to retract the financial dossiers, and to let the family breathe before they were completely annihilated by the scandal. I asked him why he cared so deeply about Caleb's accounting firm and Evelyn's charity board. I told him he had more than enough personal wealth to weather a temporary social storm. That was the exact moment the final, pathetic layer of the Parker family facade crumbled into dust. Martin let out a dry, broken sob. He confessed that there was absolutely no personal wealth left. The booming regional supply company he boasted about at every single country club dinner had been operating at a massive net loss for 5 consecutive years. To maintain the illusion of absolute prosperity, and to fund the extravagant, relentless lifestyle Evelyn demanded, they had begun borrowing heavily against their own legacy. He admitted that he and Evelyn had quietly taken out a massive second mortgage on the primary residential estate. When that capital ran dry, they signed over the deed to the historic family apple orchard, taking on a high-interest commercial loan from a predatory shadow lender. Every single dollar of that borrowed money had been aggressively funneled directly to Caleb. Martin explained that Caleb had promised them a guaranteed, high-yield return on a series of exclusive real estate developments. Caleb convinced them that leveraging their hard assets was simply smart, aggressive wealth management. In reality, Caleb was using my parents' equity to plug the gaping holes in his own failing investment portfolios and to finance the matching luxury sports cars, the designer wardrobes, and the endless European vacations for Brooke. The revelation washed over me like a wave of freezing water. For 7 long years, they had looked down on me from a towering pedestal of moral and financial superiority. They had branded me a disgrace to the bloodline because I chose to raise my daughter alone in a modest 2-bedroom apartment. They had paraded their wealth as undeniable proof of their righteousness. Now, I realized the absolute truth. Their gleaming empire was nothing but a fragile house of cards built entirely on crippling debt and astronomical interest rates. The shining halo they wore while condemning me was entirely financed by borrowed money they could never hope to repay. With Caleb officially suspended and blacklisted from every reputable financial institution in the state, the traditional avenues for emergency capital were permanently sealed off. The margin calls were looming over them. The balloon payments on the estate mortgages were due in less than 60 days. They were trapped in a rapidly accelerating freefall, staring directly at total bankruptcy. But arrogant men like Caleb do not accept defeat gracefully. They double down. Martin, in his desperate, tearful confession, revealed Caleb's final, frantic gamble to save the family from total ruin. Caleb had discovered what he believed was a financial miracle. He pitched it to Evelyn and Brooke as their ultimate salvation, a lightning-fast real estate flip that would instantly erase all their debts and restore their millions. He claimed he had received highly classified insider information from a desperate county clerk regarding a massive, abandoned industrial property called the Sweet Cane Works. The property was an ancient, decaying sugar refinery sitting on 40 acres of prime county land. According to Caleb's fabricated narrative, a major international retail conglomerate was secretly waiting in the shadows, desperate to acquire the land to build a flagship distribution hub. Caleb swore to my father that the conglomerate was simply waiting for the county to clear the complicated title at an upcoming public auction. His pitch was aggressively simple and entirely reckless. Caleb planned to liquidate the absolute last of the family's emergency retirement accounts, pool it with another high-risk, short-term bridge loan, and win the auction at all costs. He promised Brooke and Evelyn that the moment the deed was securely in his name, he would immediately flip the property to the waiting retail conglomerate in exactly 10 days, walking away with a profit margin exceeding 300%. My father told me that Brooke and Evelyn had completely bought into the delusion. They were clinging to this ridiculous fantasy like a life preserver in a violently churning ocean. Following the devastating exposure of the charity fraud, they desperately needed a hero. They firmly positioned Caleb as the brilliant, misunderstood savior who would rebuild the Parker legacy. Martin told me that Brooke was already back on the phone with her remaining friends, loudly proclaiming to anyone who would listen that I was nothing more than a bitter, jealous destroyer, while Caleb was the true architect of their salvation. I listened to my father weep through the receiver, begging me to somehow intervene and make Caleb see reason before he signed away the absolute last pennies they had to their names. I ended the call without making a single promise. I placed the phone gently onto the cool, polished surface of my desk. I slowly turned my leather executive chair toward the towering glass window overlooking the sprawling city skyline. A sharp, genuinely amused smile spread across my face for the first time in many months. I reached out and tapped the keyboard of my computer, waking up the dual high-resolution monitors. I opened the highly encrypted master asset portfolio for Northline Recovery Group. I typed the words, "Sweet Cane Works," into the internal search bar and pressed the Enter key. The digital file that populated on my screen was thick with bright red warning labels and severe legal risk assessments. The Sweet Cane Works was not a hidden gold mine waiting to be discovered by a genius investor. It was the absolute most toxic, deeply problematic, distressed asset currently sitting on my firm's entire balance sheet. It was a catastrophic environmental nightmare, completely strangled by archaic historical preservation laws, severe industrial soil contamination, and an absolute, impenetrable zoning gridlock. I had spent the last 14 months paying a dedicated team of ruthless corporate lawyers simply to find a tiny legal loophole that would allow me to dump the worthless, bleeding property back onto the county without my firm absorbing a massive financial penalty. Caleb was not outsmarting the commercial real estate market. He was blindly, arrogantly charging directly toward a financial slaughterhouse. He wanted to be the golden son-in-law. He wanted to stand under the bright fluorescent lights of the county auction house and prove his superior intellect to the entire world. He wanted to execute the ultimate, incredibly sweet revenge against the single mother who had dared to challenge his authority. I made my final decision in that exact, quiet moment. I was not going to stop him. I would not utter a single word of warning to my father. I was going to let Caleb walk right into that auction house, raise his numbered bidding paddle high in the air, and bid with every last drop of borrowed blood his family had left. I was going to let him pay the ultimate, devastating price for his boundless greed, right on the very stage where he desperately wanted to shine the brightest. The municipal auction center was a cavernous, aggressively sterile auditorium bathed in the harsh, unforgiving glare of overhead fluorescent lights. The air inside smelled faintly of industrial floor wax, stale coffee, and the distinct, sour metallic tang of nervous sweat. The tiered seating was quickly filling with a predatory ecosystem. There were sharp-suited local real estate investors looking for distressed bargains, board representatives from regional lending institutions, ruthless commercial lawyers clutching thick leather briefcases, and a dedicated handful of photographers and journalists from the county trade press. I arrived exactly 45 minutes before the opening gavel. I deliberately chose a seat in the absolute last row, tucking myself into the deep shadows near the rear exit doors. I wore a simple, unbranded navy blazer over a plain white blouse and tailored dark slacks. I carried no designer handbag and wore zero jewelry. I had absolutely no intention of registering at the front desk for a numbered bidding paddle. My role in this room today was strictly directorial, operating entirely behind the curtain. At exactly 10 minutes to the hour, the heavy double doors at the front of the hall swung open with dramatic force. Caleb, Brooke, and Evelyn made their grand entrance. It was a desperate, painfully transparent display of manufactured dominance. They walked down the central aisle as if they were attending a royal coronation rather than a county foreclosure auction. Evelyn wore a stark white, sharply tailored designer suit, her chin tilted upward in an arrogant, rigid posture meant to signal to the entire room that she was completely unbothered by her recent, humiliating expulsion from the local philanthropic society. Brooke was draped in an expensive silk dress, clinging tightly to Caleb's left arm like a frightened child seeking shelter. Caleb himself was the undeniable centerpiece of their shared delusion. He wore a custom-tailored, three-piece charcoal suit that screamed of desperate, over-leveraged wealth. His hair was perfectly slicked back, and his posture was puffed out with artificial bravado. They desperately wanted the local investors, and more importantly, the trade press reporters, to believe the Parker family empire remained absolutely untouchable and flush with liquid capital. They took their seats in the second row, strategically positioned right in the center aisle for maximum visibility. It only took about 3 minutes for Caleb to casually turn around and begin scanning the room to assess his competition. His eyes swept over the rising tiers of seats and inevitably locked onto mine in the back row. A cruel, triumphant smirk immediately stretched across his face. He leaned over, whispered something into Brooke's ear, gave her hand a condescending pat, and then marched confidently up the carpeted stairs directly toward my isolated seat. He stood over me, intentionally invading my personal space, radiating a suffocating cloud of cheap designer cologne and aggressive arrogance. He leaned down, placing his manicured hands heavily on the back of the empty chair directly in front of me. He sneered, his voice loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. Boasting that it was truly adorable I had come all the way down here just to watch how real, generational wealth was generated. He bragged openly about his guaranteed, multi-million-dollar flip, claiming he was merely hours away from securing the most lucrative commercial zoning deal of the entire decade. He mocked my simple outfit and my quiet demeanor, stating flatly that I lacked the capital, the professional network, and the sheer intellectual vision to even comprehend the magnitude of the transaction he was about to execute. I did not shift my posture. I did not break eye contact. I looked up at him, my expression entirely flat and devoid of any intimidation, and delivered a single, quietly measured sentence. I told him to make absolutely sure he read the entire disclosure packet thoroughly before he signed anything today. His smirk vanished in a fraction of a second, instantly replaced by a dark flash of volatile, insulted anger. He viewed my calm, genuine warning not as advice, but as an unforgivable insult to his superior intelligence. He scoffed loudly, turned sharply on his heel, and marched back down the stairs to his front row seat, his posture rigid with fury. He was now completely determined to win this auction at any cost. Purely to spite me, the chief auctioneer took the wooden podium at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning. He rattled quickly through a half-dozen mundane residential foreclosures and minor commercial lots before finally announcing the marquee property of the morning session, the Sweet Cane Works. He gave a brief, legally required description of the sprawling 40-acre parcel and the massive, decaying industrial structures sitting upon it. The starting bid was established at $800,000. Caleb immediately thrust his numbered paddle high into the air, his movement sharp and aggressive. Several other local developers cautiously joined the fray, raising their own paddles, but the bidding pool quickly thinned as the price rapidly crossed the $1 million mark. Most seasoned, intelligent investors in this county knew the land was a bureaucratic and environmental nightmare. Within 4 agonizing minutes, the contest was narrowed down to just Caleb and one other individual. The second bidder was a quiet, unassuming man wearing a rumpled gray suit, sitting 3 rows ahead of my position. He was a legally retained proxy bidder, a professional who was operating strictly under my direct, anonymous, and heavily funded instructions. My proxy did not bid aggressively. He bid with agonizing, methodical precision. Every single time Caleb raised his paddle with a theatrical, defiant flourish, my proxy waited exactly 4 full seconds before calmly raising his own, bumping the asking price up by a modest, consistent increment of $25,000. It was a calculated psychological torture tactic, designed specifically to tap directly into Caleb's inflated, incredibly fragile ego. Caleb simply could not bear the thought of losing a public bidding war, especially not with me sitting in the room silently watching his every move. The price soared wildly past $1,500,000. This figure was miles beyond any rational commercial appraisal value for the contaminated dirt. I could literally see the toxic tension radiating from the Parker family in the second row. Brooke began nervously pulling at the sleeve of Caleb's expensive jacket, her face completely pale. My father, Martin, who could not bear to be present in the room, was desperately sending a relentless barrage of text messages to Caleb's mobile phone. The screen was lighting up repeatedly, buzzing violently against Caleb's thigh. Caleb ignored every single warning. He was completely blinded by the desperate, burning need to prove his absolute supremacy to the room and to me. The auctioneer called out a staggering price of $2 million. My proxy raised his paddle one final, devastating time, bumping the total to $2,050,000. Caleb's face was now slick with a heavy layer of sweat. The veins in his neck were visibly bulging against his tight silk collar. He practically jumped out of his chair, aggressively waving his paddle and shouting his final fatal bid of $2,200,000. I gave my proxy a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. The unassuming man in the gray suit, slowly lowered his paddle and quietly folded his hands in his lap, officially withdrawing from the bloodbath. The auctioneer scanned the silent room, dramatically calling going once, going twice, and then he slammed the heavy wooden gavel down onto the podium with a sharp crack. Sold. Caleb let out a loud, highly unprofessional shout of victory that echoed off the high ceiling. He had successfully won the property at a massively inflated, completely catastrophic financial price point. He immediately stormed down the center aisle toward the county clerk's desk to finalize the transaction and claim his prize. He was handed a thick, heavily bound legal disclosure packet and a standard commercial purchase agreement. The contract explicitly stated in bold, capitalized letters that the property was being sold entirely as is, with all hidden faults, historical liabilities, and existing encumbrances permanently attached to the new buyer. Caleb did not even bother to glance at the dense paragraphs outlining the severe zoning restrictions. He did not flip to the back pages detailing the massive environmental indemnification clauses. He was far too eager to solidify his triumph and secure the deed. He snatched the heavy brass pen from the clerk's desk and scrawled his signature violently across the dotted lines, legally binding himself and his family's last remaining assets to an absolute nightmare. Caleb turned around to face the audience, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He held the thick leather folder containing the fully executed contract high above his head, presenting it to the room like a conquered battle trophy. The cameras from the trade press flashed brightly, capturing his moment of perceived glory. Down in the second row, Evelyn and Brooke stood up from their seats. Tears of profound joy and massive relief were streaming down their heavily powdered faces, ruining their expensive makeup. They were openly weeping because they genuinely believed their golden son-in-law had just successfully executed the ultimate financial miracle to save their sinking ship. They were embracing each other tightly, celebrating the magnificent dawn of their restored empire. I remained seated in the quiet shadows of the back row. I did not move a single muscle. I just sat there in the harsh artificial light, silently watching my family celebrate their own spectacular, legally binding execution. My eyes completely devoid of any emotion whatsoever. The ink from Caleb's signature was barely dry on the heavy stock paper when the reality of his arrogance began to set in. He stood near the county clerk's desk, breathing heavily, still riding the adrenaline high of his massively inflated victory. With a smug, self-satisfied flourish, he finally flipped open the thick leather-bound disclosure packet he had just legally bound himself to. He expected to see standard transfer boilerplate, the kind of minor administrative hurdles he usually paid junior associates to make disappear. Instead, his eyes landed on the first page of the addendum, and the triumphant, flush color instantly drained from his face, leaving him an ashen, sickly gray. The document was a severely restricted historical preservation mandate. It explicitly detailed that the entire central facade of the Sweet Cane Works, including the towering brick smokestacks and the sprawling, structurally compromised main processing floor, was protected by a strict state heritage designation. It was absolutely forbidden to demolish, alter, or significantly modify the footprint of the structures. The international retail conglomerate Caleb had banked his entire family's future on required a completely flat, leveled expanse to build their modern distribution hub. In a single paragraph, Caleb's guaranteed multi-million-dollar commercial flip was completely annihilated. The land was entirely useless for any modern commercial or retail development. His hands began to shake violently as he frantically turned to the second page. A newly updated county zoning map was attached, stamped in bright red ink just 3 weeks prior. It illustrated that 75% of the surrounding acreage, the exact space designated for the massive commercial parking structure, had been officially reclassified as a high-risk environmental flood zone. It was entirely ineligible for commercial paving or structural foundation work without a specialized mitigation project that would cost tens of millions of dollars. Caleb was hyperventilating now, tearing through the heavy pages, his breathing echoing loudly in the cavernous, emptying hall, the nightmare compounded with every single line of legal text. He found a heavily fortified, century-old railroad easement cutting diagonally across the only viable access road to the property. It granted a regional freight company permanent, unhindered right-of-way, effectively severing the main commercial logistics artery. No fleet of distribution trucks could legally or logistically enter the facility. Then, on page 12, Caleb uncovered the ultimate financial death blow. Buried under a dense section regarding historical tax incentives was a massive federal clawback provision. The previous owners had secured extensive tax credits under the strict legal promise of completing severe structural renovations by a rapidly approaching deadline. By acquiring the deed as is and interrupting that renovation timeline, Caleb instantly assumed the entirety of the defaulted tax penalty. He had not just purchased a worthless, undevelopable swamp, he had unknowingly strapped a multi-million-dollar federal debt directly to his own chest, payable immediately upon the legal transfer of the deed. He flipped wildly to the very last page, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He found the seller's signature block, tracing the chain of title through two obscure limited liability corporations. At the very bottom, printed in stark, undeniable black ink, was the parent holding company executing the sale. It read, Northline Recovery Group. The heavy realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The mysterious, desperate seller looking to offload the toxic property was me. I had legally, brilliantly engineered the entire auction to flush the absolute worst, most radioactive asset out of my firm's portfolio, and Caleb had willingly, arrogantly, paid me $2,200,000 of his family's borrowed money to take it off my hands. I stepped out of the shadows of the back row and walked slowly down the carpeted center aisle. The auditorium had mostly emptied, leaving only the county clerks compiling their paperwork, the security personnel, and my horrified family. My footsteps were quiet, but to them, they must have sounded like a marching execution squad. I stopped exactly 5 feet away from Caleb. Brooke and Evelyn were standing just behind him, their celebratory tears drying into masks of absolute confusion as they watched Caleb physically crumbling over the legal binder. They did not yet understand the paperwork, but they could read the absolute devastation radiating from his shaking frame. I looked directly into Caleb's wild, terrified eyes. I kept my voice entirely calm, entirely devoid of any gloating or theatrical malice. I stated simply that I had never forced him to sign a single document. I reminded him that I had specifically warned him to read the disclosures before he picked up the pen. I told them all that I merely provided the correct paperwork and the legally mandated truth, and that it was his own blinding, insatiable greed that had continuously raised the auctioneer's gavel. The sound that tore from Caleb's throat was not a word, but a primal, humiliated roar. The polished, arrogant financial advisor completely vanished, replaced by a broken, cornered animal. He lunged forward, throwing the heavy leather binder violently across the room, his hands reaching desperately toward my throat. He did not make it past 2 steps. The county auction house employs highly trained, heavily armed security contractors for precisely this reason. 2 massive guards intercepted him instantly, slamming him hard against the polished wooden surface of the clerk's desk. They pinned his arms sharply behind his back, securing him in a brutal, immovable hold while he thrashed and screamed obscenities. His face pressed painfully against the cold wood. Brooke let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, dropping her expensive designer handbag onto the linoleum floor. She fell to her knees, completely paralyzed by the sheer violence and the sudden, catastrophic destruction of her husband. Evelyn stepped backward, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. The invincible matriarch of the Parker family simply stopped functioning. The illusion she had sacrificed everything to maintain was being handcuffed and restrained in front of her very eyes. I did not flinch when Caleb lunged, and I did not smile when he was subdued. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the heavy double doors into the bright midday sun. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with the terrifying, mathematical precision of a controlled demolition, the shockwaves of Caleb's massive, toxic purchase rippled through the financial sector in a matter of hours. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the aggressive shadow lenders who had provided the high-interest bridge loan for the auction received word of the asset's true, worthless nature. They instantly issued a mandatory margin call, demanding immediate, full repayment of the capital. Because Caleb had inextricably linked his accounts to my parents' assets to secure the funding, the localized collapse triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. A cross-default clause is a merciless financial instrument. It dictates that if a borrower defaults on any single loan, they are automatically considered to be in default on all other loans linked to the same collateral. The regional bank holding the second mortgage on the Parker family estate was automatically notified of the massive default on Caleb's end. At exactly 4:45 in the afternoon, a digital courier service delivered an expedited legal notice to Evelyn's inbox, with a physical copy securely taped to the grand front doors of the Parker estate. It was a formal acceleration letter. The bank was demanding the entire remaining balance of the multi-million-dollar mortgage be paid in full within 14 days, or they would initiate immediate foreclosure and physically seize the property. In the span of a single business day, my family had gone from celebrating their ultimate financial victory to standing on the absolute precipice of total ruin. The Red Hollow County Mediation Annex was a soul-crushing building composed entirely of beige cinder blocks, flickering fluorescent tubes, and the lingering scent of institutional despair. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a grim Tuesday, exactly 48 hours before the county sheriff was scheduled to arrive at the Parker estate to permanently change the locks and physically remove the occupants. When I pushed open the heavy laminate door to Conference Room 4, I found the remnants of the Parker dynasty huddled around a cheap particle board table. The physical transformation was absolute and staggering. Evelyn was not wearing custom-imported silk. She wore a rumpled gray sweater, her face deeply lined, exhausted, and completely devoid of her signature immaculate makeup. Martin sat slumped in the corner, staring blankly at his own trembling hands, his authoritative posture entirely broken. Brooke looked physically ill, clutching a styrofoam cup of terrible coffee, her prized socialite network having completely evaporated into thin air the moment her husband was marched out of his accounting firm in disgrace. Caleb was completely unrecognizable. The polished, arrogant golden boy had been replaced by a hollow shell of a man, his eyes bloodshot from endless sleepless nights and relentless legal threats. They had requested this emergency mediation session as an absolute last resort, practically begging my legal counsel for one final meeting. As I took my seat directly across from them, placing my slim leather portfolio gently on the table, the desperate performance began. Evelyn leaned forward, tears immediately welling in her eyes. The towering arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a suffocating, weaponized fragility. She told me that everything had simply been a terrible, tragic misunderstanding. She blamed the suffocating pressure of maintaining a legacy in Wexford Ridge. She claimed the community expectations had clouded her judgment and forced her to act out of character. Caleb chimed in, his voice cracking horribly. He abandoned his aggressive posturing entirely, attempting to adopt a sickeningly sweet tone of brotherly humility. He swore that the disastrous auction purchase was a temporary lapse in sanity caused by overwhelming financial stress. Brooke reached across the table, her trembling fingers stopping just inches from mine, and sobbed about how deeply she missed her older sister, claiming that family was the absolute only thing that truly mattered when the world turned dark. I let them speak for a full 15 minutes. I let them completely exhaust their pathetic repertoire of excuses, apologies, and emotional manipulation. I did not interrupt a single sentence. I did not blink. When the heavy silence finally fell over the small, sterile room, they looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, genuinely expecting me to slide a massive cashier's check across the table and restore their shattered kingdom. Instead, I opened my portfolio. I withdrew a single, thick, legally bound document bearing the official raised seal of the state registry. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and told her that 2 days ago, A private equity entity known as Juniper Note Holdings had approached their regional bank. I explained that the bank, absolutely terrified of Caleb's massive cross default and desperate to clear a toxic, non-performing loan off their quarterly books, had eagerly sold the paper at a very steep discount. I slid the heavy document to the center of the table. I told them that I was the sole managing director of Juniper Note Holdings. The silence in the room became incredibly dense, almost suffocating. It took a few agonizing seconds for the reality to penetrate their exhausted minds. I watched their eyes widen in absolute, unadulterated horror as the truth finally clicked into place. The woman they had publicly labeled a disgraceful single mother, the daughter they had banished and starved to protect their pristine image, was now the sole legal owner of their massive mortgage debt. I was the absolute final creditor of the sprawling, iconic estate they had used as a weapon to humiliate me for 7 long years. Evelyn gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hands. She immediately, foolishly assumed this meant salvation. She reached out toward me, her voice a desperate whisper, thanking me, assuming I had purchased the debt to forgive it, believing I would let them stay in their home if they simply offered a genuine apology. I quickly and completely shattered that illusion. I withdrew a second document from my folder. It was a formal deed in lieu of foreclosure. I informed them in a perfectly flat tone that I was not there to negotiate a repayment plan, nor was I there to offer a familial bailout. I gave them exactly one option. If they signed the deed over to me immediately, voluntarily surrendering the property today without forcing a protracted, highly public legal eviction, I would formally forgive the outstanding massive debt balance. However, the contract included an ironclad addendum. They were required to sign a legally binding admission of their financial frauds, issue a complete public retraction of every smear campaign directed at me, and agree to a permanent, legally enforced no-contact order. Martin looked at the paperwork, his spirit completely broken, and asked in a defeated whisper what I intended to do with the family home. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the final, sweetest blow. I told him the Parker estate would not be flipped or sold to a commercial developer. I announced that the massive, sprawling mansion was being legally converted into the Rosie House Initiative. It was going to become a fully funded, comprehensive legal and financial support sanctuary exclusively dedicated to assisting single mothers in our county who were fighting against abusive, controlling families. I was going to take the very epicenter of their arrogance and transform it into a towering, permanent monument to the exact women they despised. The room completely erupted into pathetic chaos. Evelyn fell from her chair to her knees, openly sobbing, begging me to let her stay in just the small guest house, pleading that she could not face the humiliation of being evicted into the street. Brooke began screaming hysterically about bloodlines, crying that I could not do this to my own flesh and blood. Caleb, ever the desperate opportunist, frantically tried to pitch a joint business venture, promising he could manage the property's assets and work off the debt if I just gave him one more chance to prove his brilliant worth. I looked at the three of them, a writhing, desperate mass of broken pride and severe consequence. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I simply spoke one single, definitive truth. I told them, "You do not need me. You only need my money." I picked up my pen, signed my portion of the finalizing documents, and stood up from the cheap chair. I left the deed sitting on the table for them to sign, leaving them completely trapped in a nightmare of their own meticulous design. I turned my back on the Parker family and walked out of Conference Room 4 without a single backward glance. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the annex and stepped out into the brilliant, warm afternoon sun. I pulled out my phone and dialed Naomi's number. When she answered, I smiled for the very first time in days, my voice light and entirely free. I told her the heavy work was finally done and asked her to get Rosie ready, because we were going out for the biggest plate of pancakes in the city. The long war was finally over, and the boundary I had drawn was absolute, permanent, and perfectly sweet. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. And do not forget to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.